Back to our top story tonight. Iranian missile strikes on U.S. and coalition targets in Iraq. That is retaliation for the U.S. killing of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. More than a dozen Iranian missiles launched from Iran targeted at least 2 locations in Iraq, including the Al-Assad air base housing U.S. troops and Iraqi troops, and Erbil, where some Canadian personnel are also stationed. Tonight, U.S. officials saying there are very few, if any, casualties, but no matter what, this is an extremely dangerous escalation of tensions between these 2 longtime enemies with potentially global consequences, which is why we need to talk. So joining me now are experts: Janice Stein from the Munk School of Global Affairs, Besma Momani from the University of Waterloo's Center for International Governance and Innovation, and in Detroit tonight, Saeed Khan of Wayne State University. So Besma, if we can start with you, I'm not sure people are surprised that there's been a retaliation. We've been talking about it for days, but in your estimation, what determines whether this ends or escalates right now?
So I think what we're going to see moving forward is actually de-escalation, which is fantastic news for everybody. The fact of the matter is it seems as though there was no U.S. service personnel killed on these bases, which is really important. I think that allows Trump to save face. The fact that there is no address tonight, it seemed as though also reports of Esper and Pompeo, that's the Secretary of Defense and State, who visited Trump in the White House, have now gone basically back to where they came from. And so I think things are now going to cool down, but it was a very busy night, and I think many of us were on the edge of our seats wondering if this was going to be a war.
Okay, so I think the world wants your take to be the right one. Janice, anything tonight surprise you at all?
No, I actually think the Iranians launched a very disciplined, limited, it's hard to believe that when you see the missiles flying, Adrian, but limited strike, 12 to 30 missiles on 2 bases, along with the most extraordinary message that came out tonight on Iranian Telegraph, which said, we're going to launch this wave and possibly one other, and that will be it if you do nothing, if you don't respond. If you do respond, Haifa and Tel Aviv will burn. I cannot remember somebody launching a strike and saying to the adversary, this will be it if you don't respond. That is a very strong message. The Iranians do not want to take this to all-out war.
The messaging was also interesting, I found, because throughout the night, Iranian state news agencies were systematically sending out messages clearly for domestic consumption.
Absolutely.
Laying claim to this. They really want this to be a win at home, clearly.
That's right. I mean, there was tremendous pressure on the Supreme Leader, and he went to the National Security Council meeting, and he said, look, there have to be 2 things. It has to be open. It has to be obviously from Iran, and that condition was met, and it has to be against U.S. assets. Take those 2 parameters, Adrian. What was done tonight was about at the lowest level that one could imagine.
Saeed, can you help us understand here, what do you think gave Iran to the confidence to take this chance tonight?
Well, I think there's 2 things to consider here, Adrian. One is the confidence which they demonstrated with the accuracy of their missiles. These were certainly on point. The other thing that I think is important to also recognize is where was the U.S. defense system that allowed for the missiles to penetrate at least the outer perimeter and be able to strike successfully. But I think another word that we need to also consider here is perhaps compulsion. Given the very massive outpouring of public grief and anger at the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, and the fact that the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was presiding over the services, over the funeral, weeping over the coffin, meant that the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Council, had to do something. Perhaps some of us were wondering whether this is a bit earlier than we thought that they would act, but they did. And as Basma and Janice so aptly pointed out, it was very, very proportionate. It was very, very disciplined. And the Iranians essentially showed what was in their sheath. In many ways, that would be seen as a rather gentlemanly way of striking back.
So, Besma, you know, I think as a Canadian, when you hear that Erbil was among the locations that was hit, you immediately think, aha, okay, we know there are Canadians at a base near there. Can you help people understand what exactly the Canadians are doing there and what changes about that mission, you know, tonight?
Yeah, so Operation Impact has 850 troops across the region. By my count, there's about 500 in Iraq. We don't know exactly where, but we do know that Erbil was one site that indeed they were visiting. And of course, I think this is a very tense time. We've seen in the past 2 days discussion and debate about where the Canadian troops are going to go. My understanding is some of them are making their way out to Kuwait at the moment. Certainly there are many allies as well. The Germans are trying to vacate to Jordan. Others are following suit. So it is not a safe time, I think, for our troops to be in the region. We knew that they were going to be in harm's way. But what this means for the operation, which was really there to help train and build the capacity of the Iraqi Federal Army, is in doubt. And that's a real shame because, in fact, the Canadians were doing a lot of good there. The Iraqi army is highly factionalized. We saw it pretty much wither into these kinds of sectarian factions back when ISIS was in town. This is not good for the Iraqi Federal Army in the long run. If Iraq is going to stand on its own 2 feet and be able to, frankly, be able to dissuade the Iranians from having their way in their country, particularly their military force and these powerful militias that have such a strong role in the military, the Canadian and the NATO forces that are there to train the Iraqi military is sorely needed, and their job is not done.
But understanding that the job is not done, but this puts some pressure on the Canadian government. Janice, what are you expecting to hear from them?
I mean, there's no question. The Chief of the Defence Staff, Jonathan Vance, talked about thinning out Canadian forces, and so I'm cautiously optimistic here, Adrian, that they're out of harm's way. But there's a larger question here. The Iranian parliament has asked that U.S. troops withdraw from Iraq. The Iraqi prime minister has supported that. Now, we're still not there. But the whole notion of having a coalition training mission in Iraq, I think, is much more politically fraught now after all this. And I think the biggest risk in all of this is not war between Iran and the United States, but it's actually civil war in Iraq. If these tensions continue to build. You know, there were Iraqi casualties tonight. That's the one thing.
They get forgotten so often.
They get forgotten, and that's the one thing we know.
So, Saeed, very quickly, we don't have much time left in this block, but I spoke with a State Department spokesperson yesterday who said that the fight against ISIS will continue. She was very confident of that. Are you confident this is the case?
Well, there's an irony, isn't there, that it was the Iraqi militia who were trained and coordinated by Qasem Soleimani, who were doing most of the heavy lifting on the ground in Iraq in trying to repel ISIS. So the fact that on the one hand, the United States is making statements that they are going to continue unabated in the fight against ISIS, that seems a little bit strange, particularly when we saw a rather embarrassing letter from the Pentagon, erroneously sent perhaps, that the United States is already planning its withdrawal of forces from Iraq. So we're getting mixed signals that are coming out of the White House, the Pentagon, and the State Department as to exactly what is America's future policy and its strategy when it comes to Iraq. The idea of ISIS being in place still in Iraq must be vexing for the United States. If they're planning on staying and if they're planning on having a redeployment of more troops, then the distraction of Iran and the Iraqi militia, who I'm sure they're worried about having retaliatory strikes against them, is going to be a problem if they are then looking to combat ISIS as well.
All right, everybody, we have to take a short break. Besma, I want to hear what you have to say about ISIS coming after this. So please, you three, stick around. We have a lot more to discuss. When we come back, what to watch for next in this developing story. More on our top story tonight. Iranian missile attacks on U.S. and coalition targets in Iraq launched from inside Iran. Retribution for the U.S. killing of a top Iranian general and a very dangerous escalation of tensions in an already volatile region. So here's what we know. There have been at least 2 targeted locations in Iraq. Iran's foreign minister tonight tweeting Iran, quote, took and concluded proportionate measures in self-defense, and that Iran doesn't seek escalation or war, but that they will defend themselves. So there's no word yet on casualties, although the U.S. officials tonight saying that there are very few, if any. Helping us make some sense of this, Janice Stein from the Munk School of Global Affairs, Besma Momani from the University of Waterloo's Center for International Governance and Innovation, the Middle East expert at Wayne State University, Saeed Khan. So Besma, I promised I would ask you about this. Will the fight against ISIS continue?
Yes, but I think, the fight against ISIS needs to be expanded more so than being described today. It's not so much that ISIS is active on the ground in Iraq. If we really want to fight ISIS, we need to, one, build the federal army of Iraq, make it able to stand on its own 2 feet so that it can take care of its own, create a federal army that has that national spirit that's not being swayed by pro-Iranian militia known as the PMF or the PMU. That I think would be, very much welcomed by many Iraqis, and also, to address the remaining conditions inside the country of refugees, lack of reconstruction and building in Mosul and other areas where ISIS once flourished. There's a lot of local grievances inside northern Iraq, and if we want to prevent ISIS 2.0, it would be wise to address that. But our goal there really is to make an Iraqi federal army able and capable to stand on its own 2 feet and be a professional military that it should be. So we've got a lot of work to do still there, and I'm afraid this has now really jeopardized that broader mission.
Okay, I have one question for each of you, just to close this out. Besma, what are your sources telling you about what we should be watching for next?
I mean, look, the one thing I was looking for was the fact of the matter of are there U.S. casualties on that base? That is a sigh of relief. Will Trump now want to sort of ratchet it up again? I don't think so. I do believe that Trump's instinct is not to go to war. I know that it's really hard for people to see and understand, but you just need to look at his base. His base has not been happy with him, believe it or not, in some respects, for, just even the ratcheting up the rhetoric and killing Soleimani. They have no interest in a war in the Middle East. But that said, Trump is very much swayed by optics, does not want to be the man that lets Benghazi happen again on his watch. That's reference to Libya's embassy being attacked and the ambassador killed there. And what happened with the Iranian-backed forces who basically stormed the Baghdad embassy was just too much for him.
Saeed, what are you watching for next?
Well, I'm looking at two things. I agree with Basma. I think that for Trump, the domestic political calculation is still there, and in fact probably offsets his risk aversion when it comes to being at war. But what I'm really looking for is statements coming from Moscow and Beijing. After all, Iran was conducting joint naval exercises with both Russia and China a few days ago, and they are a very important player within the Persian Gulf now, especially China with the Belt and Road Initiative. And given, of course, Vladimir Putin's relationship with Trump, it seems as though they will be able to temper the situation in Iraq and between Iran and the United States.
All right, so Janice, last word to you. Very quickly, if I'm sitting at home right now and I'm pretty anxious hearing this news, how anxious do I need to be?
You do not. You do not need to be anxious. As I've said, we are nowhere near an all-out war. It was a real break tonight, Adrian, that Trump did not speak. That was obvious to me a big step back. I hope he doesn't speak tomorrow. If he could get through 24 hours where he doesn't speak, that would make it a really excellent day, frankly. The bigger picture here, and here's a great irony, Soleimani was actually carrying messages from Iran to Saudi Arabia. It was going through the Prime Minister of Iraq. If we see signs that back channel is going again, that will be a really strong indicator that we are through this phase. So I'm keeping my eye on that. Wouldn't that be a good thing?
All right, thanks. Thank you all for coming in tonight, for sharing your insight. Janice Stein, Besma Momani, Saeed Khan, great to have you. And if you have any questions about the tensions in Iran, what it could mean for Canada, please go ahead, send us a note at thenational@cbc.ca. We will put them to our panel of experts to answer, debate, and discuss a little later this week.